The United States was fully aware of the aggressive actions of Germany and Japan as they were both expanding their empires in Europe and in Asia. But America wanted to have nothing to do with those growing conflicts. Here in the United States, we were dealing with the Great Depression, and many Americans were still remembering the horrible losses from World War I. And we were practicing what we called isolationism. We were avoiding entering any conflict. We did not want to sign any treaty or form an alliance that would pull us into a war. In 1937, President Roosevelt, in a speech, referred to these aggressive nations as a disease that other nations must work together to quarantine. And slowly, over the next 3 years, public opinion here in America would change. And America's role prior to entering World War II would be the lend, lease, and sell of war materials, primarily to the British, and their efforts to fight off Hitler and the Germans. But of course, everything would change here in America on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, when the Japanese would launch their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto and the Imperial Japanese Navy began planning the attack on Pearl Harbor a year in advance. The plan was to crush the Pacific Fleet and destroy the battleships, which were a symbol of power for the United States of America, in hopes that it was also destroy American morale. Now, on the morning of the attack, the Japanese destroyed or damaged all 8 of our battleships, just over 200 aircraft. 1,200 Americans were wounded and 2,400 Americans were killed. But there were some targets that morning that the Japanese missed. 1, our aircraft carriers. There were none in the harbor that morning. They were all out at sea, so they were safe. 2, the Japanese did not bomb any of our submarines that were based there at Pearl Harbor. And that was very important because early in the war, with so many of our ships either damaged or lying at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, our subs were basically all we had to throw against the Japanese. 3, they didn't bomb any of our ship repair facilities there at Pearl Harbor, so that allowed us to repair some of those vessels right there at Pearl and get them into the fight much faster. And 4, they didn't touch our fuel storage tanks there, and so we had plenty of fuel and oil to start the war with. Another part of the Japanese plan of attacking Pearl Harbor was to use what they referred to as their secret weapon. 5 Japanese Midget Submarines. Their job would be to try to sneak into Pearl Harbor prior to the attack, lay there on the bottom until the aerial attack started, then surface and fire their much more powerful torpedoes into American vessels before hopefully returning to their motherships who were out at sea. That plan almost cost the Japanese the element of surprise. At around 6:30 a.m. on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, the USS Ward, on patrol outside the entrance to Pearl Harbor, spotted a periscope in the defensive area. It approached the target, fired upon it, and sank it. Now, the crew members of the Ward didn't realize it at the time, but they had just fired the opening shots of World War II for the United States of America. Each of these 5 Japanese Midget submarines carried a crew of 2 men. Now, these crew members were not volunteers. They were carefully selected by the Imperial Japanese Navy. And they knew, if selected, they couldn't refuse the assignment for fear of being punished. And they also realized after this mission, they would probably not return home. At 3:30 a.m. on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, Japanese midget sub HA-19 was released from its mothership several miles from the entrance to Pearl Harbor. And almost immediately, the vessel ran into issues. Its gyro compass malfunctioned. It was very difficult to steer. But its commander, Ensign Sakamaki, continued on the journey, arriving just outside the entrance to Pearl Harbor shortly after the aerial attack had already started. 3 times he tried to enter the harbor, and each time he would hit a coral reef, finally becoming grounded on the coral reef until being blasted off the reef after being fired upon by American naval forces. He then began to make his way back to the mothership, and they continued to encounter problems. Once again, they couldn't guide themselves properly. The batteries inside the submarine began to emit fumes, and they began to pass out or almost lose consciousness. And eventually they decided to abandon ship. As they abandoned ship, they were to destroy it so it would not fall into the hands of the enemy. Even that went wrong. The explosive charge failed to detonate, and as Sakamaki was making his way to shore, his fellow crew member was swallowed up by the waves. And the following morning, after being washed ashore, Sakamaki was captured by American forces, and he would become the first Japanese prisoner of war of World War II. He would be known as Prisoner Number 1. When the attack on Pearl Harbor started, our American military personnel jumped into action. They began to break open ammunition lockers in order to fire weapons at these Japanese airplanes that were strafing and bombing our ships and airfields. And one of those brave Americans was an African-American sailor from Waco, Texas, and his name was Dorie Miller. Now, Dorie had been allowed to join the Navy, but because of the color of his skin, there were only certain jobs that he could do. And he was on board the USS West Virginia that morning, serving as a cook. He had just finished serving breakfast when the attack started, and he began to feel that ship shake, rattle, and roll. And he runs up on deck, and one of the first things he encountered was his severely wounded commanding officer. And Miller, along with several other sailors, moved him to a safer location. And then Miller went to work. He had been assigned a battle station. He was not allowed to fire the weapon. He could only carry ammunition and help load the weapon. When he arrived at his station, he discovered it had already been destroyed in the attack. He moves to another battle station where for a period of time he continued to help load that weapon until he spotted an unmanned 50 caliber machine gun, and having never been trained on it, having never fired it, he began to blaze away at these Japanese airplanes. Dorie Miller would be one of the last sailors to leave the USS West Virginia. After the battle, the growing civil rights movement here in America learned about the brave actions of an African-American sailor, but the Navy would not release his name. Eventually, enough pressure was put on the Navy that they released his name. Then there was talk of awarding Dorie Miller with a medal. That took a little work also. It took the President of the United States, FDR, stepping in to make sure that Dorie Miller would receive a medal. And 5 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, another fellow Texan from Fredericksburg, Texas, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Area of Operation in World War II, Admiral Chester Nimitz, pinned onto the chest of Dorie Miller the Navy Cross. Dorie Miller would be the first African American to ever receive that medal. Now, sadly, 2 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Dorie Miller and about 500 of his other fellow sailors lost their lives in the Pacific. Dorie Miller did not get to return home after World War II and see the changes that would take place in this nation with the end of discrimination and the end of segregation. That in a small way, Dorie Miller played a role in that. And recently, the United States Navy announced that a new aircraft carrier that is currently under construction will be named in the honor of that brave sailor, the USS Dorie Miller. What an honor for someone that did not get the recognition they deserved so long ago. Of the 18 ships destroyed during the attack on Pearl Harbor, the one that is most remembered is the USS Arizona. On that fateful morning, that vessel was hit by a number of bombs dropped by the Japanese. It would be the one that would hit the magazine up by turret number 1 that would basically lift that ship out of the water, blowing it up It would sink within 9 minutes, and the fires would continue to burn for 2 days after the attack. The crew, which numbered around 1,500, only 335 would survive. The following day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress, asking and receiving a declaration of war against Japan. The opening line of the speech was December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Here at the National Museum of the Pacific War, one of our more popular artifacts is a hatch that came off the superstructure of the U.S. Arizona. People often stand before this artifact and they are mesmerized. They can look up at the right corner of the door, the right upper corner of the door, and see an egg-shaped hole that is cut there. It was not caused by enemy fire. That was caused by American rescuers who cut into that hatch looking for survivors. Other portions of the exhibit include parts of Japanese airplanes that had been shot down during the attack, an oil-splattered uniform of a sailor that was at Pearl Harbor that fateful morning, and the head of a sledgehammer that came off of the burned-out deck of the USS Nevada. And that sledgehammer had been used to break open the lock on ammo storage cabinets in order to begin firing at the enemy. One day, those remaining survivors from Pearl Harbor and our other World War II veterans will be gone. But artifacts like the Japanese Midget Sub, the hatch off the U.S. Arizona, they will continue to be here in the museum in order to remind people of the sacrifices made by so many Americans during World War II. We will continue to tell the story and share the experiences of those that are referred to as America's greatest generation.